Imagine this. You're standing in line at your local bank, just another ordinary day. The quiet hum of air conditioning, the soft clicking of keyboards, and the occasional shuffle of papers. Nothing out of the ordinary. But then, without warning, the peace is shattered. A simple transaction goes wrong. And in an instant, everything changes. One man, one torn check, and the spark of a fire that would soon consume everything. Darius Washington, a war veteran with years of service under his belt, stepped into Premier National Bank on Peachtree Street with a calm demeanor. His hands, worn from 3 tours in Afghanistan, rested confidently on the counter as he handed over his disability check. To him, it was just another routine deposit. But to Brittany Coleman, the teller standing on the other side of the counter, it was something far different, something she didn't understand, something she was about to make a huge mistake over. Brittany's eyes scanned the check, her expression shifting quickly from professional to suspicious. It was a government disability check, but there was something about Darius, the way he looked, the way he dressed, that seemed off to her. In her mind, he didn't fit the profile of someone who should be walking in with a legitimate check. She didn't see a decorated military veteran. She saw a problem, a potential scam, and without hesitation, she reached for the check. In the blink of an eye, the paper tore apart, the sound slicing through the calm atmosphere like a scream. The pieces fluttered onto the counter like fallen leaves, and Darius didn't even flinch. But the rest of the room did. People turned their heads, their eyes wide with surprise. The security guard, one standing casually by the door, shifted uncomfortably. An elderly woman in the back, sensing something was terribly wrong, fumbled for her phone, her fingers shaking as she prepared to record. Others followed suit, their phones rising into the air, capturing every moment. Brittany didn't care. She crossed her arms, a smirk on her face, as though she had just won some small victory. "You're going to have to leave," she said, tossing the torn check into the trash without another thought. To her, this was just another fraud case, another day on the job. She didn't understand who she was dealing with. She didn't understand what she had just done. Darius remained still. His expression was unreadable, his voice calm but unwavering. "I'd like to speak with your manager," he said, the word quiet, but carrying the kind of authority that only comes from someone who's seen far worse than this in their life. His tone was even, almost attached, but it wasn't because he didn't care. It was because he had learned, through years of hardship, that nothing in this world could break him so easily. Brittany barely looked up. She was too busy with her own little world to care about the consequences of her actions. "Sure, whatever," she said, dismissing him as if he were just another inconvenience she had to deal with. She didn't know that in the next few moments, everything would change, for both of them. Behind Darius, the atmosphere was changing. An elderly Asian woman, her phone now raised, whispered to her screen, "Y'all need to see this." Her finger hovered over the live stream button as the first wave of discomfort began to ripple through the room. She knew something wasn't right. The security guard shifted his weight nervously. More customers were now craning their necks, unsure what was happening, but sensing that it wasn't just another bank transaction. It was something bigger. Then Devin Harris, the assistant manager, emerged from the back office with an air of authority. He was the type of person who believed in solving problems by flexing his position, not by thinking things through. He looked at the torn check, then glanced at Darius, sizing him up with a look of mild irritation. "What's going on here?" Devin asked, his voice cool, almost dismissive. "We have protocols for suspicious documents," he continued, eyes scanning the pieces of the check on the counter. "And this check looks suspicious." Darius stood motionless. He didn't argue, didn't raise his voice. He simply asked in the calmest way possible, "Could I speak with your manager?" His voice didn't waver, didn't rise, but it carried the kind of presence that made Devin pause for a split second. Devin, who had been hoping to brush the situation aside, did exactly the opposite. His response was quick, almost automatic, as he dismissed Darius again. "I'll deal with this," he said, his tone one of authority. But he didn't realize who he was dealing with. He didn't realize that Darius wasn't someone to be easily dismissed. The elderly woman behind Darius was no longer whispering. She was recording, her fingers moving quickly, as she captured the unfolding scene. The security guard, once relaxed, was now looking around, unsure of what to do. Other customers had started to pull out their phones. No one could ignore the mounting tension. What started as a simple check-cashing incident was quickly spiraling into something much larger. Brittany's smug attitude remained unchanged. She tapped her nails against the counter, her eyes flicking over to Darius, as though she was daring him to protest. But he didn't. He remained still, his hands flat on the counter, his gaze focused and steady. He wasn't there to cause trouble. But he wasn't about to let this pass either. He knew what had just happened. He knew that this wasn't just about a torn check. This was about something much deeper. As Darius waited, his mind was calm, but he couldn't help but feel a small knot of anger rising in his chest. It wasn't just about the check. It wasn't just about the way he was being treated. It was about the way so many people were judged every single day by their appearance, their race, their clothes. And it was about to explode in the most unexpected way. Then came the words that changed everything. "I understand you think you're entitled to special treatment," Devin said, his voice louder now, drawing even more attention. "But this is how banks operate in the real world." Darius's jaw tightened. The words "real world" hit him like a slap. Devin had no idea what it meant to survive the real world, to face constant danger, to fight for a country that sometimes doesn't fight for you in return. But Darius wasn't here to argue about who had suffered more. He was here to get what he was owed, and he wasn't leaving until he did. Behind them, the elderly woman was still recording, her fingers trembling slightly as her phone's screen flickered with notifications. More people were now watching. More people were paying attention. Mrs. Chen's live stream had begun to spread, and comments began to flood in. "This is disgusting. Get his badge number. Where's corporate?" Darius checked his watch. It was 3:04 p.m. He had time, but he wasn't in any rush. The calm before the storm was almost over. The storm was coming. The seconds ticked by, each one heavy with anticipation. The tension in the air was thick, palpable, as the crowd began to swell around Darius, drawn to the unfolding drama. Mrs. Chen's live stream was picking up more traction with every passing second, and the comments flooding in were growing more heated by the minute. It wasn't just a single interaction now. It was turning into a spectacle, a moment in time that was quickly becoming public knowledge. Devin still tried to maintain his air of authority, leaned against the counter, his arms folded. He glanced back at the torn pieces of the check on the counter, and then at Darius, still standing in front of him, unshaken. "You know, sir," Devin said, his voice taking on a slight edge of mockery, "we're just doing our job. We can't just cash every check that comes through here, especially if it looks suspicious." His words carried the weight of what he thought was an unquestionable truth. But it was clear that the more he spoke, the more people were beginning to see him for what he truly was. A man who relied on his position to mask his lack of understanding. Darius didn't answer right away. Instead, he simply stood there, observing Devin, studying him like a piece on a chessboard. It wasn't anger or frustration that Darius felt. It was a quiet, patient certainty. He knew how this would play out. He had seen situations like this before. People like Devin, people like Brittany, they always assumed that their authority could crush someone else's dignity. But what they didn't understand was that dignity wasn't something you could tear apart. It wasn't something you could just destroy. It was something that grew stronger when it was challenged. "You know," Darius finally spoke, breaking the silence, "I served 3 tours overseas. This check isn't just some piece of paper. It's my life, my service." His voice was steady, firm, but there was a hint of something else there, a quiet pride, perhaps, but also a resolve that made Devin pause for just a moment. Devin didn't seem moved. His eyes flicked to the torn check again, the pieces still scattered across the counter like broken promises. "Anyone can say they've served," he muttered dismissively. But there was something in Darius's eyes that made him hesitate. Just for a moment. That was the first crack in the facade. But Devin was determined to hold his ground, his posture rigid and unyielding. "Do you have any ID to prove that?" Brittany chimed in, her voice dripping with suspicion. Her tone was sharp, and there was no attempt to hide the disbelief in her words. Darius didn't respond right away. He simply reached into his jacket with slow, deliberate movements. The room held its breath. He pulled out a military ID, the kind that was hard to fake. The room went quiet as Darius placed it on the counter. It was more than just an ID. It was a statement, a symbol of his service, a reminder of the years he had spent fighting for his country. The plastic gleamed under the fluorescent lights. The words Purple Heart, Bronze Star, and Combat Infantry Badge emblazoned on it in bold letters. Brittany glanced at it briefly, but then, almost as if she were dismissing it, her eyes flicked away. "Yeah, that could be fake too," she said with a shrug, her tone condescending. Devin, who had been watching this exchange with increasing unease, stepped forward, trying to regain control of the situation. But his voice faltered as he glanced down at the military ID again, then at Darius. For a moment, he looked unsure, but he quickly masked it, trying to assert some authority. "I don't think you understand," Devin began, but Darius cut him off before he could finish. "Understand what?" Darius's voice was calm, but the underlying tension was unmistakable. "That you're discriminating against me because of how I look? Because I don't fit the image of what a war veteran should look like in your eyes?" The question hung in the air, unanswered. Devin's jaw clenched, but he couldn't find the words. The power dynamic had shifted. It was no longer just a customer arguing with a bank employee. It was about something much bigger, something much more significant. Behind them, the room had grown even more still. People were watching now, their phones raised, recording every moment, every word. The elderly woman, Mrs. Chun, had her camera trained on the exchange, the viewer count on her live stream climbing by the second. It wasn't just a local incident anymore. This was going viral, and everyone could sense it. A businessman standing near the door, who had been quietly observing, pulled out his own phone, starting to record as well. His face was a mix of confusion and frustration. But there was something else there, too, a recognition of what was happening. His phone screen was already lighting up with notifications. The story was spreading, and it was spreading fast. Darius didn't pay attention to the growing crowd, the whispers, or the camera flashes. He was focused solely on the moment, the words that had been said, the assumptions that had been made, the way he had been treated. And it wasn't just about him. It was about the countless others who had been judged before him, dismissed, humiliated, all because of the way they looked or the assumptions people made about them. He glanced down at the torn check pieces scattered across the counter, the remnants of his dignity, and then back at Devin. "You think you're just doing your job," Darius said quietly, his voice almost too calm for the situation. "But you're not. You're letting your biases control you, and that's the real problem." The words were like a punch to the gut. They hit harder than any argument or confrontation could. Devin looked like he wanted to say something, but nothing came out. He was at a loss. Brittany, still standing behind the counter, looked uncomfortable now. The smugness that had been so prevalent moments ago was gone. But then the door to the back office opened, and the true weight of the situation became clear. Angela Torres, the branch manager, walked in. Her heels clicked sharply against the marble floor, a sound that seemed to freeze everything in place. She took in the scene before her with an expression carved from stone. Her eyes swept over the torn check, the frustrated customers, the growing crowd, and then settled on Darius. "What's going on here?" she asked, her voice sharp and professional, but with an undertone of authority. It wasn't a question meant to gain understanding. It was a question meant to assert control over the situation. Devin, still trying to save face, explained in the most condescending tone he could muster. "We have a potential fraud situation. This individual is trying to cash what appears to be a counterfeit government check." The use of the word individual instead of customer didn't go unnoticed. It was subtle, but it was a clear indicator of how Darius was being treated. He wasn't a veteran. He wasn't a person. He was just an individual. Another suspect in the eyes of the bank's employees. Angela Torres, looking at Darius for the first time, circled him like a predator sizing up its prey. Her eyes swept from his worn jeans to his plain T-shirt, then to the shattered check on the counter. The judgment was clear. She picked up one of the pieces of the check and held it up, as if she were an expert on counterfeit documents. "These government checks have very specific security features. she said loudly enough for everyone to hear. Watermarks, special paper, micro-printing. She held up the torn piece of paper, shaking it for effect. This doesn't feel right. The accusation hit Darius like a slap in the face, but his expression didn't change. He didn't flinch, didn't react. He was past the point of feeling surprised. He had heard this all before, but the onlookers, the growing crowd, could feel the tension building. The silence was broken only by the soft tapping of Brittany's nails against the counter, a rhythm that seemed to mock the gravity of the situation. The words had been spoken, the tone had been set, and now it was just a matter of how everything would unfold. Angela Torres, the branch manager, stood over the counter with a cool, calculated demeanor, her fingers lightly gripping the torn piece of the check. She was trying to make sense of the situation, but there was something about the man standing before her that made her feel uneasy, despite the walls of authority she had built around herself. "Ma'am, this check doesn't feel right," Torres repeated, her tone growing more assertive. She was trying to justify her actions, attempting to gain back control over a situation that had already begun to spiral out of her hands. Government checks are made with special paper, watermarks. This, she gestured at the torn pieces, doesn't seem to match up. Darius remained still, his hands resting flat on the counter, his gaze unbroken. His eyes didn't show anger or frustration. Instead, there was a calm intensity in them that made Torres pause. She had dealt with fraud attempts before, but this man wasn't just another customer. He was different, and she wasn't sure why yet. The feeling gnawed at her, and the room was growing tense as more customers watched the drama unfold. "I'm not sure you understand." Darius spoke softly, but his voice carried weight, carrying far beyond the walls of the bank. "This check is a part of my life, a part of my service to this country. You're not just tearing up paper. You're tearing apart years of sacrifice." Torres froze, her hand still holding the torn check, but her focus shifted. For a moment, the reality of the situation set in. She wasn't just looking at a piece of paper anymore. She was standing in front of a man who had earned his right to stand in this bank. His service not just a line on a piece of paper, but a testament to something far greater. But instead of giving Darius the respect he deserved, she merely stared down at the check, still unsure of what to do. She wasn't accustomed to being challenged in this way, especially by someone like him. The power dynamic she relied on, the unspoken rule that the customer was always the one who had to prove themselves, was quickly crumbling. Behind Darius, the elderly woman who had started recording everything was now holding her phone up higher, her fingers trembling with a mixture of nervousness and anticipation. She wasn't the only one recording anymore. More and more phones came up from the crowd of onlookers. A businessman in the corner had begun filming, muttering under his breath about how this was going to make waves. There was a shift in the room, an unspoken recognition that something important was happening here, and it wasn't just a bank transaction. "Why don't you just let us check this properly?" Torres suggested, still trying to maintain control, but her words lacked the authority they once had. The camera lenses trained on her made it clear she was losing her grip. People could see it, hear it in her voice. She was no longer a professional manager of a premier national bank. She was just a woman trying to cover up a mistake. Darius, unfazed, glanced around the room. His calmness was both unsettling and commanding. The crowd had grown. People in line who had been waiting for their turn at the bank now stood back, clearly more interested in what was happening than their own banking matters. Even the security guard, Terrell, who had been standing near the door, looked at Darius with a mix of uncertainty and discomfort. Darius could sense that the moment was bigger than just him. He wasn't just fighting for his check. He was fighting for something much larger, the dignity of every person who had ever been judged unfairly, ignored, or disregarded because of their appearance. And the longer this dragged on, the more the room realized that this wasn't just a routine confrontation. This was an act of defiance. Darius was standing up for every individual who had been underestimated, disrespected, and made to feel less than they were. "I'm asking for your manager," Darius repeated, his tone still calm but now carrying an undertone of finality. His voice cut through the tense silence in the room. "Not for you to judge me, but for someone who can make sure this gets resolved." His words weren't demanding, they weren't loud, but they were filled with quiet power that cut through the noise. At that moment, Devin, who had been lingering in the background, shifted uncomfortably. His posture, once confident, now seemed uncertain. He exchanged a glance with Torres, as though silently hoping she would take control. But Torres wasn't ready to make a move. She was still trapped in the web of her own assumptions, her own biases. She wasn't the only one who had misjudged Darius. Devin had assumed his calm demeanor was a sign of weakness, but now he was beginning to wonder if he had miscalculated. The crowd had been quiet up until now, but as Darius spoke again, his words rang out with surprising clarity. You tore up a legitimate government document. You've humiliated me in front of all these people, without even understanding who I am. I don't need your sympathy, but I do need you to recognize that I have rights, that I deserve respect. Darius wasn't asking for permission anymore. He wasn't asking for understanding. He was making a statement, and it was clear to everyone in the room that he wasn't going to back down. I've asked for your manager 3 times now, Darius continued, his voice firm. You've broken the law, you've discriminated against me, and you've made this public. I won't leave until this is resolved. The tension reached a fever pitch. The room seemed to hold its breath. Customers now stood in stunned silence, some glancing nervously at each other, others still holding their phones up, recording the entire exchange. The atmosphere in the bank had shifted from one of quiet inconvenience to one of intense confrontation. Torres still hesitated, unsure of how to proceed. Her instincts told her to escalate the situation, to call the authorities, to throw Darius out of the bank. But something told her that doing that would be a mistake that would only make things worse. She could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on her. Suddenly, Darius's phone buzzed in his pocket. He glanced at it briefly, his thumb hovering over the screen before he slipped it back into his pocket, without making a move. It wasn't a message that would change things. Not for him. But it was a reminder of the bigger world outside this bank, the world that was beginning to take notice of what was happening inside these walls. Torres finally broke the silence. I'll call the police if you don't leave, she said, trying to regain control. But the words felt hollow as soon as they left her mouth. Darius smiled, but it wasn't a smile of amusement. It was a smile of certainty. Go ahead, he said quietly. Call them? The room went silent again, the weight of those words hanging in the air. This wasn't just about a torn check anymore. It was about the message that had been sent, and the message Darius was about to send back. The room stood still. The quiet hum of air conditioning, the faint rustle of paper, and the distant sound of downtown traffic outside faded into the background as all attention shifted to Darius. His calm demeanor, his unwavering posture, and the quiet authority in his voice had transformed the situation from a simple misunderstanding into a showdown of principle. This wasn't just about a check anymore. It was about respect, dignity, and the power of quiet resistance. Angela Torres, standing behind the counter, now faced the consequences of her actions. Her mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. She had just threatened to call the police on a man who had done nothing but try to cash a check. The weight of that decision settled heavily on her shoulders. Could she really go that far? Could she really escalate the situation, knowing how many people were watching? Her fingers trembled as she glanced down at the torn check. She had already made her decision, but the cold reality was sinking in. Behind her, the growing crowd was watching. They had heard the threat. They had seen her treat Darius like a criminal, and they were waiting to see if she would follow through. But then, the sound of a door opening snapped her back to present. A man walked in, tall and confident, his suit immaculate, his eyes scanning the room like a hawk. His presence filled the space, drawing all eyes to him. He wasn't just anyone. This was Devin Harris's boss, the branch's manager, Angela Torres' superior. Darius had known that this moment would come. It had been building ever since Brittany had torn up his check. He wasn't surprised when the manager walked in, but he was ready. His eyes locked on Torres' face, where the realization was beginning to dawn. She was about to make a choice, and he was about to make sure she understood the gravity of that decision. The manager, a man named Brian Martinez, walked straight up to the counter, his eyes quickly assessing the situation. He wasn't like Torres or Devin. There was something more measured about him. His gaze moved from Torres to Darius, then back to the torn pieces of the check. "What's going on here?" Brian's voice was calm, authoritative, but there was something in his eyes that suggested he already knew the answer. He could tell from the tension in the room, from the way Devin stood stiffly beside him, that this wasn't a simple fraud case. Darius's gaze didn't waver. He didn't need to explain. The way the pieces of the torn check lay on the counter was explanation enough. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he gave the manager a moment to take it all in. "This is a veteran, sir," Darius said quietly. "A man who served 3 tours overseas. And you just had your employee tear up his check in front of everyone. That's the situation." His voice was calm but edged with an authority that made Brian's chest tighten. Brian glanced at Torres, and for the first time, there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. "You did this?" he asked, his voice low, almost disbelieving. Torres didn't respond immediately. Her mouth opened and closed, but no words came. She had no excuse. She had no way to justify her actions. She had treated a man who had served his country with nothing but disdain. She had assumed that he didn't belong in the bank, that his check was fake, simply because of how he looked. And now, that assumption was about to cost her. "Ma'am, we need to resolve this," Brian said, looking back at Darius, trying to steady his voice. "I'm sorry this has happened." His words were genuine, but the apology felt too late. He knew that there was no fixing the moment, no way to take back the disrespect. This was a much bigger issue now. It wasn't just about a check anymore. It was about the systematic treatment of people based on appearances, based on assumptions. The room was quiet now, the murmurs of the crowd fading into the background. Darius took a deep breath. He wasn't done yet. He had more to say, more to reveal, and he knew that the time was right. "I want to speak to corporate," Darius said, his voice steady. "This needs to be resolved, and it needs to be resolved properly. I'm not leaving here until it is." The calm certainty in his voice left no room for argument. He had made his decision. This was no longer just about a torn check. This was about exposing the truth. Behind him, the elderly woman, Mrs. Chun, had been recording the entire exchange. She had stayed quiet up until now, but her fingers had been moving furiously across her phone screen. She knew the power of what she was documenting. She wasn't just recording an argument. She was recording a moment of reckoning. As she continued to record, her voice cracked through the stillness in the room. "Y'all need to see this," she whispered into her phone, the live stream picking up steam. The viewer count began to rise. 500 viewers. 1,000. 2,000. Comments flooded in, calling out the discrimination, demanding accountability. Whereas corporate, "This is disgraceful." Someone called the news. The comments kept pouring in, each one louder than the last, pushing the situation to a boiling point. Brian stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do. He had just entered the scene, and everything was already out of control. But as he looked at Darius, as he saw the quiet determination in his eyes, he knew there was no turning back now. There was only one option left. "I'll make the call," Brian said, pulling his phone from his pocket. His fingers hovered over the screen, but before he could dial, Darius interrupted him. "No," Darius said firmly. "I want you to call them, but I'm going to be the one to speak to them." Brian hesitated for a moment, but nodded, handing over the phone. Darius's calm confidence had left no room for argument. He knew what he was doing. He wasn't just going to allow the bank to brush this under the rug. He wasn't just going to let his dignity be torn up without repercussions. As Darius took the phone from Brian, he dialed the number with precision, his fingers moving quickly across the screen. "Patricia Wong," he said quietly as the call connected. "I'm in branch 447 on Peachtree Street. I need to speak to someone who can help resolve this properly." The line on the other end of the phone crackled, and after a brief silence, the voice of Patricia Wong, regional director, came through. "Darius, how's the field research going?" Her tone was warm, but it was clear that she wasn't just asking about routine business. She was aware of who he was and what he was doing. Darius smiled to himself. He wasn't surprised that Patricia knew who he was. He wasn't surprised that the woman on the other end of the line had anticipated his call. But he also knew this wasn't about field research anymore. This was about something bigger, about making sure that what had happened here didn't happen again. "I'm standing in the branch right now," Darius replied, his voice steady, "and I need you to make sure this gets fixed. Right now." The conversation with Patricia Wong wasn't as simple as it seemed. As Darius spoke to her, the tension in the room intensified, as if the walls themselves were closing in. The customers, still recording, could feel it. The silence, the weight of what was being said, and the dawning realization that something bigger was unfolding right before their eyes. "Darius." Patricia Wong's voice came through clearly. "I understand the situation. I've been following the live stream. What do you need me to do?" Darius's response was deliberate. He wasn't here to plead for his rights. He wasn't here to beg for an apology. He was here to make sure that the system that had failed him, that had failed so many others before him, was held accountable. He wasn't about to let this moment slip by. He had seen too much injustice in his life, had been on the receiving end of too many assumptions, to let one more act of prejudice slide under the radar. "I need you to send someone who can make this right," Darius said firmly, his voice calm but carrying the full weight of the situation. "I want a public apology from this bank. I want an investigation into how employees are trained to handle situations like mine. And I want every customer who witnessed this to know that this behavior will not be tolerated." As Darius spoke, the room seemed to hold its breath. Even the security guard, Terrell, who had been quietly watching the situation unfold, felt a shift in the air. He had seen his fair share of confrontations. But this was different. This was bigger than any one person. This was about making a statement, not just to the bank, but to the world. And in that moment, Terrell realized that what had started as a simple misunderstanding had turned into something that would be talked about for years to come. Patricia Wong, on the other end of the phone, was listening carefully, her voice steady but with a hint of concern. "I'm sending someone from corporate immediately," she assured him. "And Darius, I want you to know that this will be handled. But I also want to be clear, this isn't just a matter of a check being torn up. This is about a larger issue, one that's been building for a long time. I'll personally oversee the investigation." "Thank you," Darius replied, his tone not shifting from the calm authority he had maintained throughout. "But just so we're clear, this is not just about me. This is about every single person who has walked through these doors and been treated like I was. I'm not the only one who's been judged based on the way I look or the assumptions people make. But I'll be the one to make sure it doesn't happen again." As Darius ended the call, the room seemed to exhale, but the tension didn't dissipate. The energy in the air had shifted, and now, instead of just spectators, the customers had become participants in the unfolding drama. They were no longer passive bystanders to an injustice. They were witnesses to a moment that was sure to make headlines. The first wave of recognition came as the businessman who had been recording spoke up. He had been watching the exchange with growing amazement, and now his voice broke the silence. This is crazy," he muttered, speaking as much to himself as to the others. "This man just changed the whole game. He's calling out the system. We're witnessing real change here." The comments on Mrs. Chen's live stream exploded. "This is the moment we've all been waiting for. This is how you stand up for yourself. Finally, someone who won't just roll over." The viewer count continued to climb, now past 5,000. The hashtags #PremierBankShame and #DignityProtocol were trending. The quiet murmur of approval from the crowd began to grow. It was as if a silent wave of solidarity had formed between Darius and the people who had been watching. For the first time, the atmosphere in the room shifted from one of tension to one of quiet support. The customers were beginning to see that this wasn't just a one-man battle. It was a call to action, and they weren't about to let Darius stand alone in this. Devin, the assistant manager who had been standing to the side, looked completely out of his depth. He had initially believed that he could handle the situation by dismissing Darius, by following the rules and making assumptions. But now, he was realizing just how much he had misjudged the situation and how wrong he had been. He had thought that his role in the bank, his power to control the customer experience, would give him the authority to make this go away. But Darius wasn't like any other customer. Devin began, but Darius cut him off with a single, calm gesture. "Don't speak," Darius said. His voice was steady, but there was a finality to it that made Devin take a step back. "You had your chance. You chose to ignore the truth. Now, you'll have to live with the consequences." The moment was thick with tension. The customers, the staff, and even the security guard were all waiting to see what would happen next. It was clear now that things were escalating, but no one was certain where the story would go. One thing was undeniable. Darius had taken control of the situation, and it was no longer in anyone else's hands. Brian, the branch manager, was the only one still trying to salvage something from the wreckage. He stepped forward cautiously, trying to regain control of the conversation. "Mr. Washington, I want to sincerely apologize for how you've been treated today. But I need you to understand that this situation is—" Darius raised his hand to stop him, his eyes never leaving Brian's face. "Don't apologize just because you're being filmed. Apologies are hollow, without real change. I don't want your apology. I want you to do something about it." Brian's expression shifted. It wasn't just about customer service now. It wasn't just about fixing the torn check. This was about the deeper, more complex issue of systemic bias and the way it had seeped into every corner of the bank, from the tellers to the management. "I understand," Brian said quietly, "and I will do something about it. I will ensure that this is handled properly." But as Darius turned to face the crowd, a small part of him knew that the conversation wasn't over. The change he had sparked here would ripple outward. People would talk. Social media would keep the story alive, and the bank would have no choice but to answer for its actions. Darius didn't need to win every battle. He had already won the war. The phone buzzed again in Darius's pocket, this time with a text notification. He didn't check it immediately. He didn't need to. The weight of the room, the tension in the air, was more than enough to keep him anchored in the moment. The bank, with its polished marble floors and flashy signs of wealth, now felt like a prison. He was the one who had turned it into a battlefield, and he wasn't about to back down. Brian, still standing on the other side of the counter, seemed to shrink under the weight of Darius's presence. There was a moment of quiet before he spoke, his voice carrying a new tone, one of uncertainty and genuine concern. "I don't think we realized the severity of the situation until now," he said, his eyes glancing toward the torn check on the counter. Darius wasn't looking at the check anymore. He was looking at the people around him. The customers who had been passively watching were no longer just bystanders. They were participants. Some were still recording, but many had lowered their phones to pay full attention, as if they understood that this moment was important. Something bigger was at stake than just customer service. It was about accountability. It was about dignity. "I don't expect you to understand," Darius said, his voice steady but tinged with an underlying intensity. "What I expect is for you to act. To take responsibility for what happened here, not just with me, but with everyone who's been treated this way." His words hit harder than any confrontation could have. He wasn't just talking about the torn check. He was talking about a system that had failed too many people before him. And now, he had the power to make sure it didn't fail anyone again. As the words left his mouth, the air in the room seemed to shift once again. The silence was gone, replaced by murmurs of agreement from the crowd. More customers, realizing the gravity of what had just occurred, began to step closer. The businessman with the phone, now standing near the entrance, looked back at Darius, his voice filled with a mixture of admiration and disbelief. "Man, I've never seen anything like this," he muttered, his phone still recording. "You're showing them how it's done. This is what real leadership looks like." Darius didn't acknowledge him immediately. He didn't need to. His focus was on the bigger picture, the bigger battle. "When we let people like Brittany and Devin make judgments based on appearances, based on assumptions, we're complicit," he said, his voice growing more passionate with every word. "And it doesn't stop at the banks. It doesn't stop in this room. It spreads." The elderly woman who had been recording the whole time, Mrs. Chun, continued to watch, her eyes never leaving the screen of her phone. The live stream had already garnered more than 10,000 viewers. As the comments flooded in, she could see the support growing from every corner of the internet. It wasn't just a local incident anymore. It was a national conversation. "Someone needs to call the news." One comment read, "This is how you stand up for yourself." Another comment came quickly after, This man is changing the game. The hashtag Premier Bank Shame had exploded across social media, gaining traction at a pace that was impossible to ignore. The bank, once a place of calm professionalism, was now at the center of a media storm. It was all because one man had refused to accept being treated unfairly. Darius, who had been silently observing the crowd, now turned back to Brian, his eyes unwavering. "You're not getting it yet, are you? This isn't just about the check. It's about what it represents. It's about every customer who's walked into this bank feeling less than human, judged by the way they look, by the way they dress. Every time someone's walked in here and been treated like they don't belong, this is what it feels like." Brian stood there, mouth slightly agape, trying to formulate a response, but the words wouldn't come. The realization was sinking in. The bank wasn't just facing a minor complaint. This was bigger than a single disgruntled customer. This was about an entire system built on assumptions, and Darius had just pulled the curtain back. The entire operation, the way the bank treated its customers, was now under scrutiny, and there was nowhere for them to hide. Darius didn't wait for Brian to speak. He wasn't going to give him the chance to dodge responsibility or make excuses. He wasn't here to settle for anything less than complete accountability. He was here to change the system, not just his own situation. Behind Darius, the security guard, Terrell, stepped forward slowly. He had been watching everything unfold with quiet interest, but now he felt compelled to act. The moment he spoke, the entire room fell silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. "Mr. Washington," Terrell said, his voice measured but filled with sincerity, "I want to apologize too. I should have stepped in sooner. I should have recognized what was happening. I'm sorry." He paused, his gaze shifting to the crowd, to the people who had been recording, who had been watching. Sometimes we don't see what's right in front of us until someone shows us. The words hit Darius in a way he hadn't expected. It wasn't just about Brittany or Devin or Torres. It was about all the people who had been complicit, even unknowingly. The security guard, a man who had spent years observing everything happening in the bank, was finally seeing the truth, and that truth was something that could no longer be ignored. Darius nodded, his face softening slightly. "It's not about apologizing. It's about changing the way we operate. It's about making sure that people like Brittany, like Devin, understand that the system has to change. We have to hold ourselves accountable." Brian, still standing in the corner, finally nodded. "I agree," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'll get this handled. I'll call corporate and we'll fix this." But Darius didn't let him off that easily. "You'll fix it, but not just for me, not just for this one situation. This has to be a company-wide change, a real change. You're going to make sure that every branch, every manager, every employee understands the consequences of actions like this. And you'll make sure that this doesn't happen again, not just here, but everywhere." The crowd was silent now, but the energy had shifted. It was no longer about a single person fighting for justice. It was about all of them, about everyone who had ever felt invisible, overlooked, or dismissed. Darius had just given them a reason to believe that they too had the power to demand dignity, to fight for what they deserved. The phones were still recording. The live stream was still running. The comments kept flooding in, and the more people shared the video, the more it became clear. This wasn't just a viral moment. This was a movement. The words that Darius had spoken had the power to change everything. And in that moment, Darius knew that it wasn't just the bank that was going to change. The world around him, the way people viewed power, the way they stood up to injustice, was changing too. One action, one confrontation, one moment of quiet dignity had made all the difference. The last words of Darius hung in the air like a heavy echo. Change isn't something we hope for. It's something we demand. The crowd seemed to hold its collective breath, waiting for something, anything, to break the tension. But nothing happened. No one moved. Everyone was transfixed, the reality of what had just unfolded sinking in. In a room full of corporate power, amidst marble floors and expensive suits, one man had stood his ground, had refused to be silenced, and had sparked a chain reaction that no one would soon forget. Brian Martinez, the branch manager, stood paralyzed for a moment, his mind racing. The customers, now a silent army, watched him closely. The cameras were still rolling, and the world outside was waiting for his next move. It wasn't just his job that was on the line anymore. It was the bank's reputation, its credibility, and its very future. The way they had treated Darius was no longer a minor mistake. It was a wake-up call, and they had to act fast before the damage became irreversible. "I'll call corporate," Brian said, his voice shaking. "I'll make sure this gets resolved immediately." Darius didn't respond. He didn't need to. He had already said everything that needed to be said. The ball was in Brian's court now, and it was clear that things were about to change. The quiet storm that Darius had stirred was building into something bigger. What started as a personal stand against injustice was now a full-blown crisis that Premier National Bank would have to reckon with. And the ripple effect was already beginning. Outside the bank, the world was watching. Mrs. Chen's live stream had gone viral, and the comments continued to flood in. The hashtag Premier Bank Shame was trending worldwide. What had started as a simple act of documenting an injustice had evolved into a powerful statement of resistance and solidarity. As the video spread, people everywhere were talking about it. People who had never stepped foot in Premier National Bank suddenly felt a connection to the story. They saw Darius not just as a veteran, but as a symbol of every person who had ever been wronged, underestimated, or dismissed. Within minutes, the story was picked up by local news outlets. Television stations, newspapers, and online platforms began covering the incident, each adding their voice to the growing outcry. The story wasn't just about a veteran and a torn check anymore. It was about institutional racism, systemic discrimination, and the power of social media to hold those in power accountable. The comments from people around the world began pouring in. "This is how you handle discrimination with grace." One comment read, "This man just exposed the truth in front of thousands of people. We need more people like him." Another comment echoed the same sentiment. "Real change starts with one person standing up." Today, that person was Darius Washington. Even celebrities, influencers, and activists began to weigh in. The story had transcended its original context and become a rallying cry for justice. Everyone from civil rights leaders to social media influencers began sharing the video. Some were offering support, while others were calling for action for a systemic overhaul of how banks, and businesses in general, handled discrimination. Back in the bank, as Brian made the call to corporate, the tension in the room remained thick. Devin, who had once felt so certain about his authority, now stood with his head hung low, ashamed of his actions. Brittany, the teller who had torn up the check, had no words left. Her arrogance had evaporated. She now saw the full scope of the mistake she had made. And it wasn't just her career that was at risk. It was the bank's reputation, its customer base, and its future. Darius stood at the counter, quietly watching the scene unfold. He was no longer just a man whose check had been torn up. He had become something more, a symbol of resistance, of defiance against a system that had long turned a blind eye to the struggles of people like him. But even as the cameras rolled and the world watched, he wasn't done yet. He still had one final message to deliver. Call corporate. Do whatever you need to do. But know this, Darius said, his voice carrying across the room. This isn't just about one branch or one employee. This is about a bigger issue, the systemic bias that exists in every corner of this country, in every institution. And if we don't start holding people accountable, then nothing is going to change. We'll keep having the same conversations, making the same mistakes, and nothing will ever improve. His words were measured, but they were also filled with a quiet fury. Darius wasn't just speaking for himself anymore. He was speaking for thousands, millions, who had been wronged in similar ways, who had been overlooked or discarded because of their race, their appearance, their class. He was speaking for everyone who had ever been made to feel small in a world that valued image over truth. The live stream continued to capture the moment, the comments scrolling faster now than ever before. People across the country were tuning in, watching, waiting for the next chapter of the story to unfold. Some were holding their breath, hoping the bank would take responsibility, hoping for real change. Others were eager to see the fallout from this confrontation, eager to see if Darius' stand would lead to real consequences, or if it would be brushed aside like so many other injustices before it. As Brian finished his call with corporate, he turned back to Darius. "They're sending someone from the regional office, and the investigation will be immediate," he said, his voice lacking the confidence it had earlier. "I'll make sure this is handled." Darius nodded, accepting the answer for what it was. But he wasn't about to let the bank off the hook so easily. "Good. But let's be clear," he said. "This isn't just a PR move. It's not just about saving face. This is about changing the system. You can't just throw a few people under the bus and expect everything to go back to normal. If you want to fix this, you need to start by acknowledging the problem, not just in this branch, but across every single branch, every single employee. This isn't something that can be swept under the rug." Brian met Darius's gaze, finally understanding the weight of the words he was hearing. It wasn't just about one moment. It wasn't just about one person. It was about everything that had led to this point. All the small slights, all the unnoticed moments of discrimination that had piled up over the years. And now, for the first time, it was being addressed. The truth was out in the open. There was no going back. The helicopter was on its way, Darius knew. Corporate would arrive soon, and with them, the real work of accountability would begin. But for now, as he stood there, amidst the cameras and the onlookers, he knew that the story was already bigger than any one branch of a bank. It had become a movement that had the power to change everything. And as he walked out of the bank, the cameras still trained on him, the sound of the helicopter's rotors growing louder in the distance. Darius smiled. Not because he had won, but because he had begun something much bigger. He had begun a fight for justice. And no matter how long it took, he would make sure it wasn't a fight anyone would forget.